When I first got on a film set way back in the 70s, I looked at this film set and I said, this is where our people belong because we're hard workers. And the whole business of 9 to 5 hadn't really affected the metabolism in a sense that because in that kind of life that where I came from, you work till the work's done. When you're bringing in wood, you bring in wood until the wood is brought in. And you're getting water, you're getting water. And it's the same thing with hunting and feeding family. And people work so hard. And so when I hit a film set, I thought this belongs to us. So it's really kind of exciting to see that it is belonging to us, you know.
So we have a lot to talk about.
Okay.
A pretty extraordinary career, I would say, and one that I might say is in the most exciting phase yet, which is not true for everybody. Pretty remarkable. Let's start, though, at the very beginning for you. Can you talk to us a little bit about the acting bug? How it got you, how old you were, when you knew this is what you wanted to do for your life?
I didn't know that this is what I was going to be doing in my life. But I grew up in an environment where we had to create our own entertainment. I grew up in a northern community, an isolated community. There was no television. We had AM, FM radio, and forestry radio. And in a world where people were storytellers. People would come, someone would come to visit, and you didn't know for sure which language they were going to speak. It would be Cree, or it'd be Dene, or mixture, or English, and so I just always had a fascination for hearing people's adventures and people's stories. That was a part of the culture that I grew up in. And then as time went on, there were some women that came to my community that came when the Air Force Base was being brought in to our community. So these were families who had lived in Montreal, say, some fancy cities in Canada, and they're white families. And so they were getting stir crazy, and they would put on shows. They put on skits. And I remember one woman in particular, all dressed up, all fancy. And our stage was at the school. It was one-room school. And they put a wire in the front. That's what we did for Christmas concerts and stuff. Wire in the front and sheets over top of it. And then you pull the curtain open, and there was Mrs. I forget what her, maybe Mrs. Harrison standing there, all dressed so fancy, and her hair all beautiful, and there's a record player there, and she lip synced Teresa Brewer's song, and it was just like fascinating. And then they created these scripts about our life that they knew nothing about. There were poker games down at the lake at Joe Cardinal's place. And that was kind of the evening events, And if somebody rolled into town with a lot of money, then those poker games would go on for a few days. But for the most part, they'd go down there earlier in the evening and maybe be straggling home about 3 or 4 in the morning or something like that, depending on how the game was going. And so, Mrs. Shannon, she would see people going by her and Mrs. Bennett's place. They'd see my grandmother and some of her girlfriends and some of the people heading out to George Cardinal's poker joint. And so they created these skits about what they thought was going on, and they're getting ready to go to Joe Cardinal's poker joint, and what are they going to wear? And using the names of people in the community, and it created quite a controversy because Granny Hilliard wasn't really appreciative of how her scenario was laid out. So, we had critics. We grew up with critics. And so that's sort of the environment that I grew up in. And then when I first moved to the city, my friend took me to see Waiting for Godot and the theater. And so those were two experiences that gave me the idea this can be ours. We can create our own stories. Because even at that age, I was starved for our own stories to be told. And so, yeah, those were the beginnings.
So, to that point, at this time in the industry, film, television, I think we're talking about 60s, 70s, right?
What I just told you about?
Well, going into further along, where you were starting.
Stories
out.
That I told you about were in the 50s and 60s.
But when you're kind of breaking out into the industry, starting to work.
That would be, let's see, I was about 20 years old. So that was 1970.
Yeah. So how did you balance what you're talking about, this desire to tell your own stories, bring these stories out there with the realities of a business back then when those stories were not being told at all? How did you even think to do that?
I was enraged. Yeah. And I was sticking up for my people. And I was going to tell the truth, whether anybody liked it or not. But the thing was, I wasn't a writer. And there was no way after I made it out of high school, there was no way I was going to submit myself to their institutions ever again. Mm-hmm. And there's this colonialism thing, constantly being told, well, you should do things this way and then you'll be accepted. And if you do things this way, then that's the right way. And I grew up in the bush. And I didn't come to be a part of this, whatever it is that they were setting up and what they saw as important. I came to tell our stories. So what happened in Canada was our Prime Minister, who is the father of the Prime Minister that we have right now, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he recognized that the American society was kind of breathing heavy over us and could suffocate us. And that we had to strengthen our culture. We had to strengthen our society in order to have our own identity and to be able to stand up to whatever the U.S. decided to do, because the U.S. was all over. That's the magazines we had. That was the television we had. There was businesses, and the U.S. was just really taking over our country and the whole psychological system in many, many ways. So he said, to strengthen our culture, poured money into the arts. And so that means Canadian filmmakers were given the mandate to create Canadian stories. And so there was this sense of pride that they had. And in that germ of thought and experience was, hey, let's hire Native people to play Native roles. What a concept, right?
Wasn't happening here.
Yes. So there was my in. And so I didn't have to go to theater school because I watched some movies, and I watched Audrey Hepburn in a movie. Beautiful, she's a great actress. And there she was, being this little Indian girl by the fire. And I thought, well, I don't have what she has, but I'm Indian. So let me in there. I can sit by that fire, And so it was that kind of confidence. And I was outraged at the way my people were being portrayed and presented. And, the materials that we had in our education system, that was really one of my first indications that there's something amiss, something is awry. And so it was through that process. And there was a curiosity within the film industry about how would I tell the story? How would I do things differently? And some were very inviting. Some directors, producers, writers were very inviting to what it was that I could contribute. And others were a little defensive. They didn't want to, they figured it was pretty wild, the things that I was presenting, because women were nothing. The roles for women were just, where are they? And it was just beginning to put men in roles, and the idea that a woman could be an orator or a shaman or some of the standard roles that were. It took a while to kind of get that idea across that as women, we're in every part of our society. And we have a culture and a world that required a lot of different skills and experiences that were rough and tough and ready to go, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
A little bit. You probably better than me. I'm curious if in those early years, I think your first film was 1978, Marie Anne, is that right?
Oh, Marie Anne. Oh, that was kind of fun because it was written by a nice little lady, and she smelled of lilacs, and she's very sweet. But the dialogue was terrible. It was all flowery in that old Hollywood way,
This is where
speaking, and I didn't know I was an actor yet, really. I would just do it whenever it came along. And I saw the script, and I said, no. And the producer was a black man from Montreal, and he was saying, well, yeah, do the audition. So I did the audition, and it was just like, oh gosh, I couldn't hardly say the words, but did it, and then I said no, thanks, I don't want to do it, and then he said, well, we'll change it. So eventually these things went on, so that when I went to do the movie, there was no dialogue.
Wow.
Yeah. But I grew up in this place where sometimes you didn't understand the language that people were speaking, right? And I used to just trying to graze their minds and see if I could understand what they were saying without understanding the words and all of this kind of stuff. And the magic is that I was staying at my sister Aunt's place the night before I was supposed to start working on this movie, where I had talked the dialogue right out. And then she left me alone in the house, so I had the TV, and there were 2 channels, maybe 3 channels in Canada at that time. And here was the French channel. And so here was a dramatic scene going on a rooftop. And I didn't understand any of the language, and I just turned off the sound altogether, and I just watched these people work. And that was my preparation for that role. Just go and just think it. And so that's how I made it through my first feature film.
Please.
Thank you.
Not the typical first feature story there. Was there anything, looking back on that now, feels very like, God, I didn't know this very basic thing about being on a film set, how to act with the camera, anything like that when you look back?
Um, what impulses? What was I learning?
Yeah, what maybe you didn't know what you didn't know.
Well, this was really the first film that I was doing with all these white people, and they were all well trained, and because I'd done smaller films and a lot of them with the Native Communication Society, which would have been industrial films, films for Indian Affairs, films for Manpower, and excuse me, fire prevention film, and so there was pretty small community. You knew everybody that was there, and so here was massive amount of strangers, and so to ground myself, I went back to how my grandmother would walk through the bush. So to understand what everybody's role was, you had to be quiet, and you had to be still, and you had to be aware, and you had to pay attention. And where was the attention when a certain noise would happen? And where would be the flow of the people when certain things would happen? And what was that language that was going on with that clapboard? And it was like in the early days of going behind my grandmother when she was hunting, and when you're in the bush and you have to pay attention. So that kind of cemented for me, and I learned a lot about how a set works by paying that kind of attention. So that's one thing that I learned, and in theater around that time, then a lot of theater stuff would be happening, and theater, you got to get some chops going on, right? And so I worked with these, I always remember the first day that we're going to start on this theater piece that was created by people in Saskatchewan and by visiting communities that were close. And then, okay, all of a sudden everybody gets up and they're starting to stretch and they're doing voice exercises. And I'm kind of like, oh, okay. There's method going on here. And so I figured, okay, it's about getting your vocals warmed up. All right. And so I just found some Indian songs. And I really adapted my culture as much as I could. At the same time as I was having to dig it up, I had to find my culture because I come from a world where we were outlawed. We're not allowed our own church, our ceremonies, our language, even our names, our homes, our parents. That's the world I came from. And in my rage, it was about digging through the rubble, this chaos that was now life, and find the gems. Find the elders who remember the stories, and to find our historians who wrote books and who studied and tried to straighten out what really happened historically, and not to accept the hypotheses of some anthropologist from maybe a German culture or something like that, and going through and working the detail of, and that's where I found that wonderful gem that I've been sharing around town as soon as I'd get a mic in front of me, is that the Cree word for fire is escoteo, and it's made up of two words, esco, which is woman, and mete, which is heart. So that's Cree word for fire. It's woman's heart. And then the stories go on to talk about the fire at the core of Mother Earth. So there you can understand why the language was outlawed. That's not really good for the economic, what do they call that, GDP or something like that? GPS. Yeah, economic GPS. So, and there's all kinds of gems in the language. And what I would do very often when I would get a script that felt kind of alien, I would do it in Cree for myself and try to ground it that way. And always the pursuit of trying to bring more authentication, something more authentic that really comes from our community. Because it was hard to break through the writing that comes from an outside culture, making assumptions of what the scene is about, assumptions on how one would react in certain situations,
There's also the matter of how much in a lot of these projects you would get to do, what the scope of a role would be. One other small movie from earlier in your career I wanted to ask you about was a film called Loyalties, which I had the privilege of seeing a restored version of it a couple of years ago. I checked, I can't find it anywhere now, which is very frustrating. Otherwise, I would tell you where to see it. But you give a really beautiful performance in that
Thank
movie,
you.
and it's a fuller character. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about coming into a project like that where you do have a little bit more to work with and how you experience that.
Oh man, that was so exciting. So exciting. Even though I had a newborn and I was breastfeeding and, all that kind of calamity and energetic renewals now and again. Well, one thing I learned about that is make sure you have an overtime clause in your contract. I didn't. It was empowering, to say the least, because this was also an issue that was not yet out into the open. Right. It was about sexual abuse. And that so spoke to me about why we do the work that we do, because there are things that need to be talked about, that need to be brought out into the open. And so that's what really fed me in keeping moving forward. And as difficult as it got at times, because I'd be getting these fresh actors put in front of me, and it was so difficult. And then the director comes to me and says, "Well, I don't know what we're going to do. The other actor looks more energetic than you do. I mean, you're looking really tired." Wow, I was really considering you better get a Tantoo Cardinal lookalike contest going on, because I can't give you any more than that. And so we had a good chat about these things. So that's another thing that happened. But that movie broke open an investigation into the sexual abuse that was going on in our communities. It was a catalyst to that. I'm not saying that one movie did it, but it came along right at a time when it was understood that there was a need for a dialogue for that. And now you have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that just finished a 6-year investigation into the situations and conditions that we have going on in our country as a result of colonialism and genocide and all of that kind of stuff. And the stats are kind of scary.
Well, one film of yours that is quite widely available, Dances with Wolves, comes out a few years later. And from what I understand, you were one of the first people cast in that movie by Kevin Costner. Can you talk a little bit about the process of being put up for that movie and what the experience was like of being a part of it?
Oh, that was really kind of interesting. For one thing, they were using a language that there were no written materials for. And so I suggested that they use a language that actors could study with and have some teachers and to really do justice to the language. So it got switched over to Lakota, where there are books and teachers and interpreters and all of this kind of stuff. So there was that. And now I'm going to tell you about some magic. I was in my backyard. I was living in Sierra Madre at that time. Yeah, I had sent out about 40 resumes and photos to 40 different agencies looking for representation in this town. Nothing. And it was just like kind of a buzz, like, did I actually do that? You know, not one response. Not a phone call, not a we got your thing, we got, no thanks, nothing. Until I got cast in that movie. All of a sudden, oh, you did. So funny. But so I was outside and I did my audition in Cree because the scenes were in Lakota now. So I did my audition in Cree, and Kevin just slid right in there, and pretending like he understood what was going on. So that was kind of fun. And then so I was reading the script. I was studying the script. I was in a lawn chair in the backyard in Sierra Madre, fell asleep. I woke up, and this is in the middle of the day, around noon, actually. I woke up, and I looked up, and there were stars in the sky at noon. And I thought, oh, wow, I've heard of things like this happening in those stories that I heard when I was a kid. And I thought, I bet when I blink, it's going to be gone. And I blinked, and it wasn't. And I knew there was something significant going on in what we were doing. And I just kind of went into the house. I wasn't going to time it or anything. I was just going to leave the magic to its own and went into the house. So that was an indication that something of great significance was happening. And it was a movie of great significance. It really impacted people. And for years afterwards, it would be a Christmas event where families would get together and watch this movie. Even with the holes, in it. And young filmmakers today are thinking that, oh, that old thing. But what I would like to say is that old thing is one of your ancestors. It opened up doors and windows. It brought new ideas and some horrible scrubs that didn't really understand why it was so successful, and they were trying to make this successful script, and it wasn't about that. It was about something else altogether. And editors are amazing. Editors are magicians, man. Because a movie that started out as a love story between these two people became a love story with the community. And of course, Kevin and Jim just broke open the budget to follow what they were learning in the course of shooting, having realizations of what this life was like. And so what we got out of it is that as Indigenous people, we were portrayed as human beings for the first time in a major motion picture in Hollywood.
This also,
Thank you.
This also begins, I think, your career of appearing in films and series that are pretty widely seen in
Just a peek.
well, exactly in roles that you make an impression, right? One you've put it in a way that I like, which is that your characters often don't have arcs; they have moments. And I'm wondering how, in a movie like this, you find that moment, you make your presence count.
Which movie?
Dances with Wolves.
Dances with Wolves. You just do it. And that's, I wasn't thinking about making it count. I was disgruntled that Kevin didn't realize that there were Indian women who did speak English. I get so frustrated at the distance between our reality and the truth of our history and what's understood in this majority society, still to this day. But we're segregated. Watch your news. Watch your stories, except NPR will cover stories of us. But for the most part, nobody knows about our economic stats or our children in poverty stats or violence against women stats, or, they don't know that we had an Indigenous woman that was out in space. There's just no communication between our nations. And sometimes I think it's because it's so dirty. They don't want, this wonderful country of humanity and justice didn't want citizens to know there's some dirty stuff in the closet, stuffed away in the back.
Indeed. Killers of the Flower Moon, now streaming on Apple TV+. The next film I wanted to ask you about, I think, did mark a correction in a little bit, which was Smoke Signals. Would you say that was a little bit more in terms of having more perspectives brought to that were Native, that allowed for a kind of expansion of the kinds of stories that Hollywood would tell?
Which movie? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Smoke Signals.
Smoke Signals.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was fun. Yeah. That was written by Sherman Alexie, and he's from town, and directed by Chris Ayres, and so much of our ways and our relationships and all of that was there, including the missing father. And see, the thing that's kind of cool about our stories is there's roles for women that are not just sex objects or, a tragic figure here or there. And so more of that. Let's get more of that. Thank you. Thank you.
At the time that film was hailed as kind of a breakthrough for Native representation, I think we're in a similar kind of moment right now. Given the frustrations you were talking about that are very rooted in the realities of this industry, how did it feel after that movie, and did you notice anything changing?
There's always change. That's the only thing consistent, right, is change. And I think it encouraged, it emboldened, it was a healer. It's a cult favorite and in our communities. And it was fodder, it was fertilizer, it was inspiration for some of our filmmakers that are around right now. Like in Res Dogs, the Harjo kid, and I'm sure he was inspired by that because that's when they were young, when that movie was coming out. And we touch each other and we embolden each other. There's so much healing that has to happen. It's a long journey back. when you're suffering colonialism and genocide and generation after generation after generation. And when I first got into this business back in 70, can you imagine? I was hoping for some comedy right quick. Naivete. Yeah. It's a 20-legged race, and you know, everybody's got to be able to get the joke. So it's been a while.
You mentioned theater earlier. I know you've done Shakespeare. You've done a lot of incredible work on stage. In this period, as your career on screen was booming a little bit, what were you doing in theater? What were some of your favorite roles?
Oh, we did King Lear. We did an indigenous version of King Lear in the National Arts Center in Ottawa. And I played Regan, the middle daughter. And then we're going along in rehearsal, and then, you know, one of the facts about our world historically is that we're a matrilineal society. And it's the women who decide what happens with the land. It's the women who decide how the economics are going to run. And actually, who's going to be the leaders. So, and Bad Regan gets the idea, what is this old man doing handing out land? And somehow working that in. And so you can only do that with attitude, right? Because it's all written. It's all written already there. And so it was a nice little window into colonialization, you know? And because it's in stone, there's no going back to the clan mothers, where the women are at the center of it. And an interesting little tidbit is it's the Iroquois society, Haudenosaunee women, that inspired Letitia Mott when she went out to Seneca Falls one day with her husband. And the clan mothers were there having their gathering. And that's where the ideas came from about what a society looks like that's run by women, what a woman's position is in a society. And check out their flyers, and some of their outfits. You look at some of that stuff, they got headbands on. And they knew at the time that Indigenous women were key, but somehow forgot about it along the way. And they got their vote, and we didn't get ours until about 1960, 1962. But the colors that were in their flyers were Haudenosaunee colors, purple and green and yellow, you know, just little clues along the way. And Hillary didn't get up Mount Everest by herself. Just in case anybody thought Hillary got up there by herself.
Speaking earlier of your fascination with languages, how did you find working with Shakespeare? How did you find? Yeah.
Oh, I loved it. It's such an old language that it felt like speaking Cree. It really was. And I was working with my dear friend, my Cree friend, Billy Morasti. And so he and I were just swinging that stuff around, you know. It was joyful. It really was.
So around this time, you start appearing in lots of series and films. How would you describe the process of breaking into Hollywood in that way? And I would imagine the grind of encountering a lot of roles that were not that exciting, maybe.
Well, I only got Indian roles. I only got Indigenous roles. But I did do Hamlet, and I played Gertrude. And that was not an Indigenous role. and though she's much of an emoticon. So that's something in common across the cultures of women. And so that was fun. That was my good friend Richard Rose, who was actually one of the first directors to haul me from the West to the East to play in a theater piece about uranium mining, and to play a native character. And so that was one of my first big trips to do this work. It was a role that was being played by a Jewish actress, and so I replaced her to play this Indian woman, and other characters that told the story of uranium mining and the role of business and government and medicine and all of these other factors that are a part of that. The play was called Boom, and we toured it. Boom.
Did you enjoy touring?
I loved it, yes. Because, a lot of the time, our people didn't go to theater. And this play would go through schools, and so you got a captive audience there. But when we'd go to community halls, it took a while for our own people, our Indigenous people, to come to these theaters, because for the most part, they're not stories that are theirs. They're not stories that maybe even would be all that complimentary, So, and after the word would start to get out, there's Native actors in this play, and so we started getting, our own people to the theaters, and it would be so different, You could hear if there's a lot of Indians in the audience, depending on where they laughed. It might be different from where other people would be laughing. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I'd love to ask you a little bit about some of the television work that you did a little bit later on. You were on some big shows like Outlander, Westworld, big productions. Do you have any memories from those sets, or even just experiencing television on that scale?
Well, the thing with Outlander is I had just finished my first feature playing a lead that was written and shot by Indigenous filmmaker Darlene Naponce. And I had experienced freedom, and this wonderful story, and everybody around me were on the very same page. There was no watching your back and double checking wardrobe, double checking dialogue, none of that kind of stuff. And I experienced this great freedom, and then I get back to a Cherokee audio with a British accent. And it was salt in the wound. I couldn't. And so I asked for a Cherokee person to do Cherokee audio. And that took a while. And so it was late, and it was a terrible experience because I was anticipating, this was a long series. It was a long story, and the character that I was supposed to be representing had some storyline going on, right? And I bought this big, thick book and ready to go. And here she's just 2 episodes, 2 scenes practically, and she's dead. And so it was pretty disappointing, but it was fabulous being in, what was that, Scotland? Amazing, beautiful, beautiful country that hasn't been torn apart by industries that are boring into the husk of Mother Earth. And it was just so fresh, and the people were beautiful and lovely, and then on second thought, I was really glad that I was knocked off in 2 episodes, and because it was enough time to be there and get out of town. and I, it's kind of like this movie that maybe can be unmentioned just yet. In that, what is it? Us old gals were just really disposable, you know, and we're not dying fast enough, so let's kill them off, That's cold. It's cold. Sorry. But it's not really understanding who we are. And I come from this matrilineal civilization, and who we are is a lot. And so I'm going to get into some producing. It's enough crying around and complaining. So thank you. Wish me luck. Wish me magic. I haven't done it before. Yeah.
The film you mentioned, Falls Around Her, an incredible performance. It is available to rent. People should definitely seek it out.
Thank you.
You play a musician in that film who returns to her community. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what it felt like to occupy that space as the lead of a film, and you already alluded to a harmonious collaboration with your director.
Yeah, and on the first inspiration, I guess, when you asked me that question, is the weather was terrible, and the ground was awful. I mean, it was probably about 2 feet deep. This murk, this kind of muskeg and mud, and some days I was wearing white, and but Darlene's cousins were, a big part of the staff. We had these little 4x vehicles that would be creating roads through the bush to be able to get to set, because overnight the road would kind of ooze over, and you couldn't get vehicles through. So we were bringing equipment in on these little 4x going through the bush, and then it would be raining, or it would be snowing, or some kind of calamitous weather as it's changing from winter to spring slowly. And there's Darlene's cousin just smiling away, and some kind of precipitation is coming down, and everybody is so happy to be able to tell our stories and write on their own land where they are at home. They're not visiting somebody else's place and listening to somebody they barely know, telling them what needs to be done. And when I first got on a film set way back in the 70s, I looked at this film set and I said, this is where our people belong, because we're hard workers. And the whole business of 9 to 5 hadn't really affected the metabolism, in a sense that, because in that kind of life, that where I came from, you work till the work's done. When you're bringing in wood, you bring in wood until the wood is brought in. And you're getting water until that's done. You don't just check the clock, 5 o'clock, and it's the same thing with hunting and feeding family, and people work so hard and graciously. And so when I hit a film set, I thought, this belongs to us. So it's really kind of exciting to see that it is belonging to us,
More so now, I think. We have more. Obviously, we have a lot of projects that you're in right now that we have to talk about. We have, for example, a Marvel series.
Oh, yeah.
Which is, in itself, the fact of Echo is exciting, right? How did you find being a part of a comic book show that was also a show about Indigenous people?
Well, when it was first offered to me, I didn't want to do it. I was sitting there. My character was sitting there sewing. for 6 episodes until she comes up with this power suit at the end, you know? And I told my agent, no, I don't want to do it. And he was aghast. And I mean, he lined up a lawyer. We got to meet this lawyer, and we got to talk about. Oh man, I don't have the stomach for it. You know, another one of those roles. And then I heard this voice say, "Make it your own." Okay, so I had my agent call another meeting, and these are Indigenous people now, and I presented. I didn't say, I'm not going to do this unless you accept these ideas. I just said, this is the person that I am. This is where I come from. And I can't sew. I have 2 aunties in my bloodline that were Queen of the North. 2 reigns, 2 consecutive reigns, 8 years each, these aunties. And that's not about putting your lipstick on in the cold. It's about strength, and it's about hunting, and it's about so many things about surviving in the North. And that's, you know, kind of the life. These women were trappers, and they lived that life. And I grew up hauling water and chopping wood and living that kind of life. So, and I said that, and I told them about my bloodline and where I come from, and I come from powerful women who go out to the bush and get the food that's necessary to feed your family. And there is not an event and not an incident that I can't check with an ancestor. That we have ceremonies. We have ceremonies in our ways where we can contact the people who know about this. That's what our ancestors are. We find our ancestors who know about this. And that's where you find the answers. That's how you can move forward. That's how I managed the arrow in the neck in Black Robe, is by listening. And so, and they were leaning forward. And so, this was on a Zoom, right? And so I kind of figured that, yeah, they're listening. And she says, oh, you want a more active role? Yeah.
It's so many words.
Yeah. that condenses it down. Yeah. And so I come, and then all 6 episodes are full of ancestors, right? Yeah. The ancestors set that up. You know that.
Integral to the character. Yeah.
Yeah.
This voice in your head that you're talking about that said, make it your own. I imagine that's something that has had to develop for you over time. Are there other roles you look back on where that did happen and you were able to bring something to something that wasn't necessarily there on the page?
Exactly. That happened in Black Robe. When we were, and this was, it's a very good film, but it was written, you know, from the annals of the church and all of this kind of stuff. And here was a scene where a woman was having a baby that was stillborn. And in the morning, she takes it to the bush and leaves it in the bush, this dead baby, right? And India's got no feelings, so that's all good, right? So, and then it was being shot in sequential order. Mm-hmm. And I suppose there's a different English word for that.
Chronological.
Chronological, right.
Both work.
Thank you. And so the AD, after lunch, was saying, okay, everybody in the teepee was for the sleeping scene. And I said, sleeping scene for what? He said, well, this is where the oblate hears the woman, sees the woman taking the baby out to the bush. And I said, oh, well, just make sure that I'm not recognized, that nobody sees me. I said, if you want a body, I'll provide you a body, but I don't want anybody to see me. He said, well, why not? I said, well, I'm not there. He said, what? I said, I'm with the woman who's having the baby. Oh, all the women would be. Oh, all the women got cut loose. They had a break. And so we were available then for when the woman comes out of the teepee with her baby to take her stillborn child to the bush. And so me and Helen were coming out, and we opened the teepee for her, and she comes out with her baby, and we're very quiet, and she walks in. Cut. No, that's, we need some dialogue, because he said, oh, we need some dialogue. Okay, so we go back again, and Helen and I are very quiet and respectful, and we say something to each other in Cree, and no. A little louder, he said, we need the oblate to notice what's going on. Oh, okay. All right. And then the song idea came. And I'm not about to say, could we have a song here? So we had our marks. So I went back into the teepee. And by the time they called action again, the song itself had come. So we come out, and I start singing. And it just changed everything. Because before that in rehearsal, there are guys going back and forth, hauling stuff, and we were filling canoes and packing to leave that camp. And as soon as the song happened, everyone stopped, held still. And it was a sacred moment while the woman took her stillborn baby out to the bush. Now, all of a sudden, the cameras were coming close. Now I had a close-up, right?
Funny how that works.
Right. It's not about words.
Another film I wanted to ask you about in that regard is Wind River. You have this scene with Elizabeth Olsen where you're essentially picking clothes out for her, winter clothes, because she doesn't have any. And it's an indelible scene for you. You're so good in it, and it feels like something that you add so much to that character. Can you maybe walk me through a scene like that, what you bring to it?
Oh, God. She's so full, that woman. And the stories of murdered and missing girls, family, it's just so close. And that's the love that I poured into that woman, that character, and the incredible strength that we have to have, and the incredible love that we have to have, because it's the same, it's a femicide situation. You don't know if you're going to see that person the next day. Sure enough, beautiful young women, just boom, gone. And where did they go? They go someplace tragic. If they're still alive, it's tragic. And if they've been murdered, it's tragic. And they're not sweet murders. They are bludgeoning. It's horrible, the hatred that there is for us as Indigenous women. I'm sure that's not the story you wanted to hear. Sorry about that. But that is the background of it. And here's this woman giving her daughters or her granddaughters clothing to this woman who's going to be helpful to somebody along the line, you know.
It's a beautiful answer. Thank you for that. And it does, I think, lead nicely into Killers of the Flower Moon. This is another horrible story, a traumatic story. When you hear about a project like this being developed, knowing the history of Hollywood, all that, and in some cases you've initially said no to certain projects, right? How do you, with this one, hear it, and the deeper you get into it, when do you realize, okay, this is something that I want to be a part of?
I also didn't want to do this one because I could see it coming down the road, that there wasn't going to be much space for me. But I did want to see that women were being treated properly. And so I saw a bit of script, and I thought, oh, it's heading in the right direction. And little did I know that's as far as it went. So, it was kind of disappointing, but I'm used to it. I'm used to that kind of disappointment, and it's a long road to getting our women to the forefront to be able to tell our stories truthfully, organically, that come from who we are. And so my contribution to this film is, again, that voice. In Lizzie's death scene, my death scene, in the script, it's Lizzie dies. But in my life, when my grandmother passed, she took me to the gates with her. So that's what I offered to this movie, is that experience of something positive. There's so much death and horrible situations that hasn't stopped. It's not over. The violence against our women is still going on. And it's brutal. Absolutely brutal. I ran across a statistic. More than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women experience violence. And that's not just murders, and it's not just being disappeared. It's men beating the hell out of us. And so that's over 85% of women can tell you a story about that. You want to hear one? No, just kidding. I could, though. And it's wicked. And I think we know why. I told you the Cree word for fire. And it's connected to that. Because we're dangerous. Our philosophy, our worldview is dangerous to wealth and power and the way games are played in this plane, this reality, in this world that we've created by heroes. The men who came here without their women and pretended they were going to talk about peace. Because this is a matrilineal civilization land that they came to, but they refused to meet with women. So that's how our structures got disappeared, is that we were not, they refused to have meetings with us. So the men had to go forward, and after a while they start figuring, oh yeah, I'm all that. And they start making decisions of their own. And then the structure that was established did not make room for women to be at the core. They liked a lot of things about the system. Both the Canadian government and the U.S. government liked a lot of things about the way the Tree of Peace Society was set up and that model of democracy, but not all of it.
So in telling this story of Killers of the Flower Moon and everything you're talking about, can you maybe talk about the community formed with your fellow actors like Lily Gladstone, Cara Jade Myers, each coming to this story with a specific kind of connection to it, the same one that you're talking about?
Well, that's something that they can talk about really nicely. So you might want to talk to them about it. Again, it's a society that, the society of the creation of that is not the society my Lizzie came from. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't that room for her. So, and there wasn't, I don't remember any real film camaraderie. There was a lot of time in the compound where when the girls weren't working and I wasn't working, we might get together. But for the most part, they had their exercise and things that they did. And my time was spent with the Osage speakers, and they took me around a lot of different places. I wanted to visit the graveyard. I wanted to get a sense of who these people are and what their history was. So I listened to a lot of their stories. I visited some of the old sites, and they took me to places that they went to when they were teenagers. And, places along the waters and places where they would go and party. And they told me stories about my character and about about Lizzie Q and the kind of life that she had. And not much of it, there wasn't any space for it in this movie. So Lizzie Q didn't have much to say, but I think I used the space I had well enough to tell the story, because the idea of murdered and missing and violence against women and escaping with your life from situations is just a part of my blood. That's what fed me. My scenes were minimal, but they were full of that experience of the violence of it all. I didn't have anybody to talk to about any of it. I had a prayer that I worked really long on, and then I was able to do the prayer. And then I see why it wouldn't be included, because I was so aware of the uncertainties in the community, about the dangers in the community, that can you imagine? You don't know who was going to make it home. Yeah. And even to go to town, what's going to happen on the way? And people couldn't even spend their own money. And that whole business of being tied up. There's just so much horror that could have been expanded, really, because I love truth, and because I think truth is where the medicine is, and we're still trying to work together. We're two divergent cultures that are trying to work together, and we're trying to learn from each other. And bless Marty's heart, man. He's so good-hearted and so kind, and really wanting to do the best thing, And so that's why he spent so much time with the Osage people, and I think the Osage people were we're really grateful for being able to give as much as they gave, much as they got to give, to the whole story. Of course, nothing is perfect, and this is a story that there's not one story. There are as many stories as there are characters. There are people, and these are people that came over the longest walk. The what do they call that? The Trail of Tears. Yeah, Trail of Tears. So no strangers to devastation, and so there's grit. There's grit, and I think it would be good for society. I always thought when I was first getting into this business and really looking around society, and noticing what was happening in our communities as Indigenous people, and what was starting to affect overall society. I was thinking, even in terms of environment, because I grew up knowing that the earth is alive. And then I find out in the 60s that scientists discovered that the earth is alive by these instruments, that they're starting to jiggle, and you're like, whoa, And so that basic difference between our societies, that difference, okay, going to the moon. Meanwhile, back at the teepee, it's the embryonic sac of Mother Earth has been punctured. So something has happened. And we have to get to understand each other. We have to come to respect each other, because there's knowing on both sides of our fence, and our children are really demanding that something change, that they need to know how this is going to be fixed.
This divergence that you're talking about, in terms of how to tell these stories, you have a pretty singular perspective as someone who's been working adjacent to Hollywood for as long as you have. How have you seen it evolve, grow, hopefully improve in some way? Taking Killers of the Flower Moon as an example, maybe to some of your earlier films.
Well, I'm going to be in Barbie.
Manifesting.
Oh, it's been done already, right? Okay. I can see, I would love to be just cast as a human being, and the human being might end up being Indian, but thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we got to kind of combine our stories, and stop with the segregation, because we got a lot to teach each other and to survive together. And our children are, they're, in some ways people say, well, we're getting rid of the segregation because our children are so mixed, and they're growing up in schools where they come from many, many cultures. But that happened when the boats landed as well. We've been doing that for a long, long time. So there's an element that we've got to explore. There's respect. And I think that Earth is our common ground, because I was thinking back when I was thinking about how are we going to come together, is that suicide was such a high number in our communities, and then I see it happening in the majority society. That's happening. There is a place that we can come to understand each other and compare notes and help each other through that kind of thing. And the place where we had the majority population was in jails. And what's going on there? And that's kind of a common experience. Addictions and all of this kind of stuff. There's since we were able to get our ceremonies back, we have our advisors back. We have our ancestors back. We have our ways, our medicines, our teachings, our ways of knowledge are coming back. And that's probably happening with all the old cultures, you know, the old cultures that are not necessarily the indigenous cultures that I come from. But everybody's got their earth song. All the cultures have their earth song and their relationship with the earth. I don't think there's a culture. You may have lost your connection with the earth, but I think just by, what creation is, everybody has their connection with the earth in some way, and you have to find it. Thank you.
I'd love to kind of wrap up our conversation on language a little bit by talking about Osage and Killers of the Flower Moon. You mentioned extensive time spent with them, but how did you find the process of working on it? And I would imagine that there's a responsibility there to be as precise as possible.
Yeah, I spent hours and hours and miles with the words, with the language. I had audio tapes, and I was, because I had my own language, I knew how the Osage would fall. I know that there's a noun. I know there's a plural. I know there's all of these different elements, the adjective, and might all be in one word. And so I learned very specific the sounds, what their roots were, and try to get it as precise as I possibly could. So I spent a lot of time by myself and out in the buffalo reserve, walking with the words, or walking around the compound where we had our housing. And so that's where a lot of my time, this is time of COVID. So there is not a lot of socializing. And actually it gave me time to get my school happening. I have a school.
I'll ask you about that.
Yeah, in Alberta. So all of a sudden it was okay to Zoom meetings. Because before that, I had a hard time. This is a school that I've been percolating and creating in my mind since I first walked on a set and said, this belongs to us. I wanted to create a school, an acting school, a film creating school, a storytelling school. But never had the funds to gather people together, and also found that you have to have the right people. You have to be careful of egos that want to come in and be boss. And the circle doesn't have a boss. The circle is a circle. And we have to pay homage to that, because that's what our youth need, our storytellers need, that sense of acceptance, that sense of value, and that their perspective is unique, and their perspective is seeing it from that angle. And there's that angle and that angle, and everybody's got this important story inside of them. And so all of a sudden I could afford a Zoom, and got people together and found this wonderful combination of people who now claim it as their own. It's Taproot Actors Academy. And the intention is to get them to dig into their own roots. Right now, we're still on the surface. There's such influence from this outside world that, you're seeing sitcoms acting going on, and it's just like, no, that's not what I meant. but but they're getting the mechanics of how you tell a story and how you get the cameras going, and then we're finding our cinematographers, we're finding our writers, we're finding our set decks, our art directors, and it's so exciting. My gosh, the parents and the guardians and the grandparents and people in the community, the social workers, they're just in love and enthralled with Taproot Actors Academy. We work 6 weeks in the summer, and then we have workshops in the winter. And first winter we did improv workshops, and second winter we did writing workshops, and we were working as a collective and pulling the stories together as we rolled in the summer. And then we decided, well, let's start with written scripts. So that's where we had the writers' workshops in the winter. So we had scripts all ready to roll. So then it was the process of auditioning and having time with these things. And so now we're pulling it together and seeing what is our next step. And it's really an organic process. And now it's getting the community going. Now we're getting adults saying, well, how come I can't? And well, there's no reason why you can't, because in my mind, originally, it was for people who had dropped out of school or who were unemployed. And, these were the people that I wanted to gather and get stories going. But the woman who really wanted to do this, and she's beautiful, she's just wonderful, she just loves these kids. She worked with young people. So our school was young people. And we had our first gathering with adults. We had about 6 adults join our group. So we're gonna start getting their stories going on, and I think that we inspired a community garden out of it, because this whole mood. While the kids are doing that, sometimes we can't go in the store because they're shooting, and why aren't we doing something? So they got a community garden going on, and who knows what's next? It's really exciting. That's the power of the arts, the power of stories and everybody being able to be part of it. We got our own little channel there on YouTube or Facebook or whatever it is, Instagram. We got an Instagram and put out a call for props. No problem. 6 bikes show up, And everybody wants to be a part of it. Yeah.
Does it take you back at all, seeing this sitcom acting, as you call it, or just auditioning, script work, to when you were first starting out and figuring this out?
I haven't been able to spend that much time with Jillian. I met her when we were doing Killers. And she's from the community. She belongs to one Métis settlement, and she belongs to a reservation. And boom, she is teaching at my school now. Yeah, she does workshops, and that's really exciting. What was the question?
Any reflection, maybe, for yourself that it's prompted?
Yeah. The only thing I think is that I get a sense of the empowerment these kids feel, and it refreshes my memories of when I found a group of kindred spirits who wanted to tell stories and play and create these things. So another amazing thing that's happened with this group is that, okay, we get the kids that weren't in the sports programs, that weren't ensconced in some kind of formal activity. So we wind up essentially with the nerds, with the artists, with, the kind of the leftover crowd. who didn't really have friends. They didn't have a group. And after the first summer, Grace, who's our project manager and the auntie of us all, she said it was so cool. Then the rodeo came in just the weekend that we finished. Then the rodeo started, and there was Taproot. Oh, this group. Oh, just traveling around all over the place. They found each other. They found their bubble. And we had kids coming out. They were able to come out to each other. And then they had the backing to come out to their parents. So we fly the rainbow flag and in our letterhead. And we don't have a building because the community has a responsibility to their artists. And that's one justification for it. But we just don't have the building.
However we have to, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have community center and we have all these different buildings that the community uses and we use them as well. And we got run of the beach and in the summer. And so that's how it works. And we have a premiere. We had a premiere. We have 2 10-minute films by the end of the summer, really. Wow. Yeah. And so the nearby community lends us their theater. And we show our films, and they get all dressed up in their best outfits and their maybe rubber boots, depending on the weather, and all this kind of stuff. But we do red carpet.
Of course.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so exciting.
I'd love to close by asking you about something that you mentioned at the beginning, which was getting into producing. Mainly because when I hear that, I hear a certain desire to take ownership, right? To tell these stories, which is what you were saying at the beginning. I know you said you're still figuring out what that's going to look like, but what about that prospect is so exciting to you, and what do you hope comes of it?
I hope that this world has an opportunity to see stories that they have never seen. I think the project that's furthest ahead is my friend who I met in Malibu, who's a Marine, who went to Vietnam, and he's from the Chumash people, from the traditional Chumash people, and their territory up around Santa Barbara. So that world of how the traditional people operate in that urban setting is the beginning and the foundation. And then he goes to Vietnam and he comes back and he's got to be healed and, what this society is, and to tell it from his perspective. So, and there's a lot to learn in that, to experience that with him. Because those traditions, they teach you philosophies about life and death, and how the healers deal with their wounded when they get back from that kind of crippling experience. That's one project, and the other one I'm not going to tell you anything about.
Fair enough. We can't wait to see what happens, though.
Okay. Yeah, me either. It's really, the idea of doing it is really daunting and exciting because I've stayed away from it. I didn't trust my lack of education because I was so stubborn. I wouldn't go to university. I wouldn't go to college. I wouldn't go, no, you're not going to colonize my mind anymore. You've done enough damage. And so I just pick up my learning here and there. So I didn't have the confidence. I thought, oh, well, all these other people that are Indigenous, they've been to university, they've been to colleges, and they've got learning. But the thing is, there's something about life experience. And I think a really precious part of my life was in the 50s and 60s. And the Renaissance had not yet begun. So I know what it was like. When we were scourge, and it was absolutely known for sure we had nothing to contribute to society, And so it's a really great base to have with any of your characters and any of the stories that you may want to create, because you know why. You know, you've got a real sense of why things are the way that they are and how long they've been that way, you know. Nothing like quite like life experience.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure all the actors in this room would agree. Tantoo Cardinal, thank you for such an extraordinary conversation. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.